Kia ora koutou katoa, e tamana whenua o nai tuarihi tēnā koutou. E nā pukenga, e nā ahorangi, e nā akanga mā, tēnā koutou katoa. Nau mai, haere mai ki te kura umanga. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Paul Ballantyne, the Executive Dean of the UC Business School, and absolutely delighted to be here today to kick off this year's Condliffe Memorial Lecture Series. The Condliffe Memorial Lecture was instituted in 2005 to honour John Graham Condliffe, who became the first Professor of Economics at Canterbury University College in 1921. The lecture series brings together leading economists to Canterbury to provide a public lecture highlighting their recent work and its relevance to broader business and the policy community. It has been held annually since 2005, except for 2020 for obvious reasons. Unfortunately, that 2020 coincided but also marked the 100th anniversary of the establishment of the economics department here at the university. The department continues to go from strength to strength. Although it's not really the focus of today, I do want to congratulate and acknowledge two recently promoted professors of economics. So Jeremy and Tom, congratulations on your professorial success. The Condliffe Memorial Lecture Series has included as distinguished speakers world-class economists, one of whom, and this is the so far part, has received a Nobel Prize in Economics after delivering the lecture. That is David Card, who was the Condliffe lecturer in 2014. So there is no pressure on you, Nathan, today at all. But from me, just a huge welcome to the school. It is wonderful having everybody here, back to having face-to-face events like this. Nathan, on behalf of the school, I do extend an invitation and hope you can be here in person one day. But for now, I'll hand it over to Laura to introduce you a bit more fully.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Kia ora koutou katoa, ko Laura Manilotto, taku ingua. Nau mai, tauti mai, ki te kura umanga, kia ora. My name is Laura Manilotto, and I'm Associate Professor of Economics at the Department of Economics and Finance here at UC Business School. And I'm this year's organizer of the Condliffe Memorial Lecture. So before we move on to today's business, I just need to take care of some housekeeping, as you know. Toilets are probably the most awkward thing to point out, as they are as far away as you can get. So basically walk towards all the way to the lifts and then tuck around on your right, and you'll find them sort of tucked away there in the back. Obvious place. Emergency exits one is right behind you, where there's external stairs. The next closest one is behind me. So you need to go out, walk to the corner, turn left and go down the stairs and exit that way. So in case of fire, we exit the building using those stairs, and then we gather outside the central lecture theaters, which I'm very challenged, I think is right there. Challenged geographically. In case of earthquakes, you drop cover and hold, you know the drill, and once the shaking ends, we exit the building using stairs again, and then meeting point is a Clyde Road car park. Now, this is the highlight, not really. If we get a notification of a police enforced lockdown, then we do need to remain inside, take cover and stay away from the windows and wait for further instructions. And if you happen to be outside, then you do enter the nearest building if it's unlocked. If not, then leave the campus for a safe location. So on that cheery note, it's my pleasure to introduce to you our 17th Condliffe Memorial Lecturer, Professor Nathan Nunn from the University of British Columbia. I would like to take us back to when Nathan Nunn the economist was born. So this takes us back to Simon Fraser University. I'm going to start to cry, sorry. This is quite unexpected, I'm sorry. I'm just so happy to introduce you here. So this is Burnaby, British Columbia, which is a suburb of Vancouver. In the mid-1990s. So Nathan actually was an undergraduate student and I was a PhD student, and our paths ended up crossing at the time. So that was pretty cool. And so He actually started as a communications major, and because he thought that film and media sounds like a lot of fun, but then he discovered economics was even more fun, obviously, and he became an economist. And as I said, I crossed paths once, and I had the pleasure to be his tutor once. He was obviously incredibly talented. He wouldn't be here today as our conference speaker if he wasn't. But also, as you can see I remember him as being extremely polite, kind, humble, just the best student to have. And I could see that he clearly enjoyed studying economics even back then. So those days, we're talking about the previous millennium, we had no social media. So we didn't cross paths for a long time. So it took us about 2 decades to find each other on social media, Facebook, it turns out. And then, of course, I went snooping, because we did have Google, then, and found out that he had continued his economic studies, that he did his master's and PhD in economics at the University of Toronto, and then started his academic career in 2005 as an assistant professor at the University of British Columbia. Didn't take long for Harvard University to see the value in this, and young Nathan at the time, he's still very young, and he took up a position there in 2007 as an assistant professor as well, and then 5 years later was full professor, and I think that is a meteoric rise. That's pretty impressive. And then we are connected. And then maybe 2 years later, he got promoted to the Frederick A. Abbey Professor of Economics at Harvard. And then this year, he returned to his hometown, Vancouver, and now he's a professor at UBC Vancouver School of Economics. So one of my favorite sayings is, I taught him everything he knows. I say that every time I see my old student. Probably doesn't apply so much in here in this case. And as you can see, he still remains as humble as he was when I knew him as an undergraduate student. And I really feel lucky that our cross paths then, because I think that's why we have the opportunity to have him as our speaker today. So Nathan's research interests are very, very interesting and potentially atypical for an economist to some extent. So I was thinking that maybe he didn't find economics fun after all, but when he got into the profession to make things interesting. And I think that's why so many of us are gathered here today, because his research just sounds so interesting. It focuses on the historical and dynamic process of economic development. In particular, he studies factors that shape differences in the evolution of institutions and cultures across societies. He has studied the importance of local contexts, such as social structures, traditions, and cultures, for the effectiveness of development policy, and understanding how policy can be optimally designed to really for the local environment. And also his current research looks at understanding the importance of these local culture and context for different economic policies, so outside of development, particularly in developing countries, though. So many of these themes will be discussed in today's lecture that focuses on shedding some light on the disagreements that are increasingly present in the world between members of different societies and sometimes even between members of the same society. They're about fundamental issues such as what is right and wrong, how we should treat others, and what is just and fair. And in his talk, Professor Nunn will explore the roots of these differences. He will discuss the theory and evidence based behind the evolution of the divergence in values and beliefs within societies. And the aim is to help provide a deeper understanding of the historical roots of divergent views, both across and within countries, particularly as they relate to issues of morality, religion, politics, and government. So that is yeah, I'm so excited to get to listen to this talk. And I actually haven't had a preview of it. I don't know what he's going to talk about, but I know it's going to be amazing. So Nathan will talk about 45 minutes, and then there'll be 15 minutes for Q&A. And after that, we have drinks and nibbles arriving, and we can do some lovely networking and enjoy the fact that we are again back here face to face. However, unfortunately, Nathan was unable to be here today face to face, but he's even bigger than not live as he's on the big screen here. So and of course, as Paul made a warm welcome to you, Nathan, we expect almost to see you here live one day soon. So without further ado, I'm looking forward to hearing your talk. So thank you, Nathan.
Great. Thanks so much, Laura. It's a real pleasure to give the lecture. And let me share my screen while we do this. And I really wish I was there in person, but yeah, within the next little while, I definitely hope to visit. And okay, so I'm going to start, and Laura gave a great overview or introduction about what I'm going to talk about. And it really is the question about what divides us. And as she mentioned, in 2007, I moved to the United States and was there until last year. And you can't live in the US and not ask that question. Why are there such divisions, particularly after COVID? So if I was to give this talk before COVID, this would be the example that I would give. Gender roles around the world, right? So women are half the population. We care about their well-being, but there are dramatic differences across societies in the beliefs about what rights women should have. And in particular, should they have rights that are equal to men? So here's just one example. It's a typical question from Pew or World Value Survey. When jobs are scarce, men should have more right to a job than women, right? You can ask the same thing about university slots, other things, education. And the proportion of population that agrees with this statement ranges from about 3% in Iceland, upwards of 95% in Egypt. So this is a dramatic variation. Almost these two populations would almost completely disagree, right? And so you might think, well, that's Iceland, and then that's the Middle East. But even if you look within Europe, and so this is showing you Europe, you have differences in the extent to which people agree or disagree with that statement, ranging from 7% agreeing in Sweden to Greece, 46%. So these are both developed nations. In Asia as well, you'll see vast differences. Okay, so that's one example. And you might think, well, it's just level of income. But here are the countries with the highest rates of female labor force participation, which is kind of an objective consequence or measure of that belief about that women should or should not work outside the home. And then the countries with the lowest. And so you can see these are all developing countries here in this case. So it's not just economics, right? And so that's one example. And that's kind of the, like I said, the example I would give historically. But in the last couple of years, there's other disagreements, which are even more, sensational to some extent, living within the US. The graph on the right-hand side, this is affective polarization. So if you ask somebody who's liberal, how close they feel to someone else who's liberal or someone else who's a Democrat, and then ask them how close they feel to someone who's a Republican, this is the gap in that feeling thermometer, right? So people actually, now there's a bigger gap in the extent to which political party is important for influencing how people feel about others, right? So there's just this polarization, this is often called. And there are events, so here's images from the attack on the Capitol, which I'll talk a bit more about. This Q, which you'll see is QAnon. It's a belief or a theory about certain things that are going on in the world. I'll talk a little bit about that. But those are kind of just two examples of disagreement. So one view, which you hear often, is, well, there are people on different sides, whether it's about gender roles or it's about politics. And one side will just say, well, those guys, Republicans, are evil, or, the Taliban's evil. Or so you could just say, there's just good and bad, and we can't really make sense of it all. That's the other thing that you could say. And this is what we'll start to try and look at. And as Laura said, a lot of my research has been thinking about these beliefs and values, which I think are really important for well-being, and trying to say, can we make any sense of it all, right? Is there any logic to any of this, right? We're not going to necessarily have normative judgments, but just like, is there some structure underlying these differences? Oh, and then this is also had these same measures, but for Canada and New Zealand, right? So now I live in Canada. It's a bit less crazy than in the United States. But as soon as I got here, we had this trucker rally, which was like the Canadian version of the attack on the Capitol. And so even in these countries, Canada, New Zealand, you still have an increase over time in polarization, right? And so so it's important for everywhere in the world. And so there's a remarkable amount of disagreement, variation in the world, and these are in the values and beliefs that are held by people. They're nearly always cultural. In other words, when we get these beliefs or these values that we hold, we don't get them in isolation. We get them from social media, from our friends, from our family, so they're socially transmitted. And in many cases, there's genuine disagreement about what's moral, right? So, you know, is it right to restrict entry of immigrants into your country? Some people will think that's the right thing to do. Others will think that's the wrong thing to do, right? And there'll be justifications and other reasons for this. And as I noted, there's as much disagreement within countries as there is between countries, right? And so, and as I said, is there a logic to any of this? Okay, so what's the framework? And I've studied this in previous papers. And then this is just going to give you the basics, but you can mathematize all of this and have mathematical models and show this, but this is just the basic logic. So the first thing to recognize is the world is extremely complex and there's much that's unknown. So unlike the models that we write down, there's just a lot of stuff that we don't know, and we're making literally thousands of decisions each day. Some of these are really difficult decisions. So what's happened is, as humans and animals in general have evolved heuristics. These are shortcuts that aid in decision making. And some people call these fast and frugal. So they're kind of shortcuts. So we don't perfectly optimize, but we can do pretty good, and we can do it a lot more quickly. And these take a lot of forms. So customs, traditions, religions, values, beliefs, moral frameworks, norms. And so these are these shortcuts that just tell us in general in these situations, this is right and that's wrong, right? And that guides our decision making. So we aren't just constantly optimizing, engaged in constrained optimization problems. So these are socially learned, often from parents, but also from peers, right? And one way to think of this is it really eliminates the need to start from scratch and reinvent the wheel every time we have a decision. So if, in other words, we could just follow the advice of our parents or our grandparents, which they got their advice from their grandparents, that's going to save a lot of time, right? And so I think that's a lot of this. Here's some examples of differences. These are just signs that you'll see in the United States. So on the left here, it says, no matter where you're from, we're glad you're our neighbor. These are literally signs people will put in their front yard. And so that has a logic that I'm going to treat everyone in the world the same, no matter where they're from. The one on the right, this is actually a very different view. In this home, we believe in God, family, and country. And if you talk to these individuals, they would say, no, I don't have an obligation to everyone in the world. My obligation is to the people in my church, to my family, and then to people in my country, right? And so I shouldn't treat everyone the same. The right thing to do, or the moral thing to do, is to treat those of my religion in my family different than those outside, right? And so, and then on the left here is science is real. That's another worldview and a heuristic one can use. And then this is related to QAnon, which is a conspiracy theory about, I'll talk a bit more about this, but about how the global elite, there's a global elite and they're kidnapping children, doing terrible things to make the poor poor. And that's how they enrich themselves, basically, is the short version of that. Okay, so that's all very sensational. Let me give you a more concrete version. And this is a version that I've talked about in the past, but I think this really provides a nice example of the importance of value and tradition and the benefits. Okay, so the image on the left is corn, and it's the way that corn is cooked in many Latin American countries. So you have corn, you'll store it dried, and then you'll put it in a boiling pot of water, and you'll boil it for about 45 minutes, and then you'll drain it, and then you'll mash it up into dough, and which is called masa. And then, but in lots of the world, what you'll do is you'll throw ash from the fire into that water, right? Or you'll throw limestone into that water. And even today, corn is cooked this way. You can buy actually essentially bags of cement in the grocery store, and then you throw it in the water, right? So then you might say, well, why is that? And if you talk to people, they'll say, well, that's how my grandmother taught me. And so, that's it, or it tastes better, or I don't really know why, but I'll make up an explanation. So it turns out there's an important explanation. So this is a tradition. It's passed down from generation to generation. People feel it's important to continue this tradition. And the reason is that if you have a diet that consists primarily of corn, then that diet is going to be deficient in a few things. And one of the things is niacin, right? It's also lysine as well. But if you don't have enough niacin, you'll get pellagra, which is a disease that gives you rashes, eventually get dementia, and then you die. But if you put lime, an alkali solution, into the water, that helps the body absorb the small amounts of niacin that are actually in the corn, right? And so this emerged, and there's a study in 1974 in Science showing this in places where corn was the primary food of the diet, and therefore pellagra was an issue, right? And so then this is how corn was cooked. And so an interesting twist to the story is corn is indigenous to the Americas. Then you have Europeans that come to the Americas, they bring corn back to Europe. So for example, Northern Italy, it's brought also to the US, and it's brought to to Africa. And the food was brought, but the cultural tradition was not brought, right? So the Europeans saw this, and then they said, oh, well, this is silly. Why would you throw this dirt into the water and cook it this way? And then what happened is all these places that consumed a lot of corn, particularly the poor populations, they developed pellagra. And so they developed these diseases. They didn't know what it was. And they thought, oh, well, maybe it's bacteria or mold in the corn. They could see the correlation. And it wasn't until 1940. So this is like thousands of years after indigenous populations in the Americas are actually cooking corn this way, that this Dr. Joseph Goldberger had discovered, oh, it's actually a vitamin deficiency, right? And no one believed him. They thought it was a communicable disease. And so if you had pellagra, you could pass it to someone else. And so he actually injected blood from pellagra patients into himself, into his family, just to prove. And he died, and they still didn't believe him. And it wasn't until later, right? And so what this tells you, and why I bring this example up, is the power of tradition, right? The power of these values that are passed on from one generation to the other generation. The power of customs, where you do things, you don't really know why, right? And but they still have benefits. People didn't need to understand the reason, and they didn't need to understand pellagra for this to have the benefits, right? And there's lots of examples of this. And here's another example, just quickly, from northern Quebec. It's a indigenous community called the Naskapi, and they have this religious belief. It's a belief in divination. So they hunt caribou, but how do they know where to hunt, right? You can go in many different directions anytime you're hunting caribou, and it's super important where you go. Well, they talk to their ancestors. So how do they communicate with their ancestors? Well, it's through something called scapulomancy, which is basically reading burnt bones, and these are shoulder bones of the caribou. And so depending on how these bones burnt, that would tell them which direction they should hunt, okay? And so it turns out this is beneficial, and the logic, for those of you that know game theory, is there's a matching pennies game. Player one, which is the hunter, wants to go the same direction as the caribou wants to go a different direction. There's no Nash equilibrium here, but the best you can do is just randomize, right? Then it turns out humans are terrible randomizers, right? And you can go into details about this, but how do you randomize? Well, that's what anthropologists believe these divination rituals effectively did, right? The way these bones cracked is essentially random. That helped to hunt, and then that was beneficial. And so that arose. And there's many cases of this. Reading tea leaves is another example of this. And so these cultural beliefs, these values, these traditions which emerge have benefits. And the interesting thing here is they work because people have faith in them, and to some extent, or they inherently value continuing these traditions. If there was a population that said, oh, this doesn't make sense to me, I don't understand it, I'm not going to do it, then they wouldn't receive the benefits of this tradition, which in these cases are quite large. Okay. And so these examples also illustrate something that's kind of emerged, and in the literature we've tried to test this in general, and they emerge from mathematical models of cultural evolution or of tradition. And that's basically that the values and traditions that exist will tend to have benefits. So it's very much an evolutionary framework. And it doesn't mean they're always perfect. There's lots of things we probably do which might not be beneficial. But in general, the values and traditions that survive tend to have benefits. And people have studied this with religions that are called big God religions like Christianity or Islam, and have argued that they facilitate large-scale cooperation, right? And as I mentioned, these things work because we have we place inherent value or value in following traditions, right? So if we kind of abandon traditions quickly, then we would have never adopted something like alkali processing of maize or the scapulomancy of the Naskapi. So one implication of this, and some of the work I've done, is just really trying to test, do ancestral environments explain contemporary cultural traits? So is there a logic to the traditions and customs around the world? Okay. And so I've done a bunch of work in this, and just really quickly, I'll give you one example that illustrates this, and it ties back to gender. And so this is with Alberto Alazina and Paola Giuliano. And it's coming back to this question about, well, why are there such dramatic differences in the way societies view women around the world, and should they have equal access and opportunity to employment outside the home, including things like politics or management of firms or just employment in general? And this is female labor force participation. And again, you can see this dramatic variation, right? And so if you just look at this, it's not a clear logic to it all. And so, but maybe there is a reason that there is this variation, right? And so there's an old hypothesis by Esther Boserup, which I remember reading in graduate school at the University of Toronto. And she hypothesizes that, well, it has to do with agriculture and the form of agriculture that different societies had. And this is 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000 years ago. So there's two dominant forms of agriculture. One, which is on the left, this is an image from South Korea, actually, in the 1950s. This is plow agriculture, where, and this would be familiar to most of us of European descent, for example, where you use a plow. This is this implement that can overturn the soil, which kills weeds. It creates furrows, which then can be used to broadcast seeds. And so that's one way. The other way, though, is called swidden agriculture, slash and burn agriculture, hoe agriculture, where the implement is a hoe, basically, right? And you might burn some forest and then cultivate it for a while, then move on to different forests. So it's a little less intensive than plow agriculture. So if you just look at the differences in these two pictures, you can see that one is going to be much more compatible to childcare, right? So on the left, if you had children running around, that's going to be a bit more dangerous than on the right, and also compatible to work done by women, right? So here, this requires a lot of upper body strength, which there are biological differences between men and women. Here, smaller amounts of dirt are moved. So she hypothesized, well, in societies with plow agriculture, where the plow was developed, that men would tend to dominate work outside the home, and then women would be relegated to work inside the home. And but with hoe agriculture, you wouldn't have that same division of labor, right? It could be along on other lines. So if you look at the data, if you dig up anthropological data, ethnographic data, you see that in the past, that was the case, that in societies with the hoe, that women tended to work outside the home, right? So the question is, does that explain what's going on today? So to do that, we started with data. We looked globally, and then we wanted to see, basically what you need to do is for each individual in the world, ask who were their ancestors, right? And what conditions did their ancestors face, right? What type of agriculture did the ancestors have? So a shortcut is we take the world's languages and dialects, so 7,000 plus. These are mapped by a group called Ethnologue, or a source from called Ethnologue. And then, so for example, here in the United States, you'd have English, right, would be a language, but you see these dots, these are indigenous populations. Same with in Canada. Africa, you have a lot of different indigenous populations that you can trace back. And so you can link these to ethnographic data. We do have information from about 1,300 ethnic groups about what was the traditional pre-industrial characteristics of those societies. So let me just give you one example. We'll zoom into Ethiopia, and this is the ethnologue polygons or shapefiles in Ethiopia. Underlying this, the shading is population density from satellite data. And for each language, we link it to an ethnic group or an ethnographic source, an anthropological source. And then we can fill in or understand, was the plow used traditionally amongst these different ethnic groups? And this is what the pattern you get for Ethiopia. And then you can overlay districts, and in different data sources, you might know only the district that a firm is located or a district that a person's located. You might know their ethnic group, so you can link it directly, but for places where you only know the district, you can create a population weighted average, okay? Then you can also create an average across countries and do this across countries, okay? And so there's a lot of analysis that can be done that just kind of gives you a flavor, but what do we find? So if we look across countries, districts within countries, even ethnic groups within districts, and I'll talk about immigrants in 1 second, what we find is consistently, if you have ancestral plow use, then you have lower labor force participation rates today, okay? You also have less female representation in government and less female firm ownership, right? So these countries, they're not involved in agriculture in any meaningful extent today, but the consequences of that historical environment through these values and beliefs still persist today, right? And also, I guess I should have wrote this, they're strongly correlated with these values and beliefs, like the example I provided about the World Values Survey, right? Should men have preferential access to jobs? And then the one thing we also do is look at the children of immigrants. So these are individuals who are in the US or in a European country. They were born and raised there, but their ancestors were from a different country. You also see the exact same effects, right? So we know it's not about labor market conditions or anything else. It's these individuals, they're from living in the same location, but they have ancestors from different backgrounds who brought this cultural trait, these values and beliefs with them, okay? And then the last thing we actually see is in a follow-up paper, more male bias sex ratios. And this is kind of even more depressing, I think, than the female labor force participation, because the sex ratio at birth, this is kind of sex selective abortion or infanticide. And then you see these biases widen as you look at children that are older. And this is all around the world. And a big chunk of this is preferential access to food and healthcare for boys. And so basically where you have the plow, you have men working outside the home. And then this then translates into different views about inequality between men and women. And the preference typically is for boys, right? And so that's one example. So if we think about, well, what divides us, what explains the variation that we see in the world, right? That there is a logic to those populations that believe that it's most natural for men to work outside the home, less natural for women. Or there's other justifications that you'll see, and you see these in surveys, like the children won't be raised as well if the mother is working outside the home. And then, but there is a logical explanation, which is rooted in the pre-industrial ecological conditions. Okay, so here's another example, which is kind of very recent work. This is the first time I've presented this, actually. And it's a different aspect. This is living in a zero-sum world. And so if you think about typically in production functions, you put in effort and then you get some output, right? But we think about reality, there's interactions between people. So if you think of your next door neighbor tells you that their kid got into university, the best university in New Zealand or whatever country they're in, you immediately think, wow, they've done so well, right? They've worked hard, that's great. But if you stop to think about it, well, actually, they obtained a spot, but that spot came at the cost of another person, the second best person, for example. So there is, in some sense, lots of benefits in the world are zero sum, right? You can't gain without someone else losing, right? And so, and if you think of, this is showing GDP per capita throughout the world. For much of human history, there's stagnation, right? So there's not economic growth, there's not knowledge creation. If you want more land, you have to take it from your neighbor, right? Lots of places in the world have polygamy. If you wanted to have a third or fourth wife, that means someone else is going to not have that individual as a wife. Same with political power. If you're the chief, someone else can't be the chief. So once you start thinking about it, a lot of the world is zero sum, even though in econ, our production functions don't allow for that actually, right? And so, and how zero sum is the world? That's an open question, right? And you can think about that. How much of the success of one individual comes at the expense of others? And actually, once you start thinking about lots of the debates in politics, and just in general about policy, lots of it really hinges on this view. So on the left is the view that's very zero sum. The top 1% of Americans have taken 50 trillion from the bottom 90%, right? So if you see wealthy people, Jeff Bezos, Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, do you view them as great? They've created all these benefits for the world, or do you think, oh, they've robbed from the rest of the world or the rest of the country? The non-zero sum view is on the right. That's extreme wealth does not cause extreme poverty. That's a different view. If the world really is zero sum, in another paper we've worked through the math, then there's a role for government actually, right? If the wealthy obtain some of their benefits by taking from workers or from the poor, then what's going to be optimal from a social planner point of view is to redistribute. So have higher taxes on the wealthy and then redistribute that to the poor, maybe through universal education or other things, right? So we kind of undertake some of this research, and it is a paper with students Sahil Shinoy, Sandra Sekera, and Stephanie Stancheva. We wanted to see, do people have zero-sum mindsets, or can we measure the extent to which their mindset is zero-sum? So it's in the back of our minds. We have this implicit view of the world. And is this important, or does it correlate with some of the policy things and policy disagreements that we see? And then if that's true, what are the roots of this? Where does this come from, right? And so we undertook a survey October 2020 to May 2022, about 15,000 people. It's online, 5 waves, about 20 to 30 minutes. And one key thing that's unique about the survey is we ask about people's ancestry. So remember, when we were talking about the example of the plow, we were connecting individuals' ancestors, the environment they faced, to their views and values today. We're going to follow the same logic here, but by asking people about their parents and their grandparents. Then we're going to measure zero sum and then policy views. So how do we measure zero sum? It's a bunch of questions like this. And we did a lot of testing for many years ahead of time. This seems to work as good as anything. Here's just one example. Actually, maybe I'll give you the last example. Number 4, in the United States, there are many different income classes. If one group becomes wealthier, it is usually the case that this comes at the expense of other groups. And you basically answer, to what extent do you agree with these statements, right? And then you can do this for all 4 questions. And then with something like a principal components, just create an index. Okay, so it's really just, to what extent do you think that the success of one group comes at the expense of another group? And we have domains like trade, American citizens versus not, ethnic groups within the United States. And what you find is this zero sum positively correlates with support for redistribution, support for affirmative action, or other policies that are going to help level the playing field, right? So that means if there are certain groups which are disadvantaged in society, that's related to the success of other groups that are successful, right? And so there is a role for government to try and level the playing field and to make things better. You see this in the extent to which people report that on economic policy, they're liberal versus conservative. And really, this just means how much government intervention do you think is okay? And so a libertarian would, in our conjecture, would have a non-zero-sum view of the world, right? And so here on the x-axis is just dividing the data into how zero-sum the different groups are, and then on average, how conservative versus liberal they are. So you see that the more zero-sum you are, then the blue bars are higher. You're more likely to have a liberal view. And then so liberal in this case means government intervention, right? And conservative would be more libertarian. And then in politics, similarly, you're more democratic and then less likely to be Republican if you have a more zero-sum view of the world. Okay, so that comes through very, very clearly. This is the full distribution if you have Democrats, which support government intervention, and redistribution. Things like universal health care would be supported by the Democrats, but not the Republicans in the US. And you kind of see this mass, individuals that are more zero-sum, they're more likely to be Democrat than Republican. So this is just the distributions version of what I just showed you. Okay. Okay, then there's a few other things which it turns out we weren't necessarily expecting this, but in some of the surveys, there were things that had just happened, like the attack on the Capitol. So this is after the election, and Donald Trump didn't want to concede, and he kind of suggested or promoted, he held a rally and then promoted a large number of individuals to go to the Capitol building and then prevent the ratification of the election. And that's what happened. And so we ask here, how sympathetic do you feel towards those charged for entering the Capitol? And it turns out if you have a more zero-sum view of the world, that means you're more sympathetic. And you see this actually for Republicans and Democrats, right? So a zero-sum view would be one group wins or the other group loses, right? That's kind of a zero-sum view, and you're just competing for power. A non-zero-sum view is actually, by doing this, engaging in this action, you're ruining democracy. We're all being worse off, right? Remember, a zero-sum view is one's better off, one's worse off. But here, it's kind of like we're all being made worse off. Okay, so that seems to explain to a large extent views about this and this event as well. And then the other one, which is was part of this, was a belief in QAnon, which is a conspiracy theory. And that conspiracy theory is basically that there are these rich elites which were trying to overthrow Donald Trump. They're also trying to do terrible things like kidnap children, use their blood for medical purposes, which benefit them. So if you listen to these conspiracy theories, they're really zero-sum theories. There's one group, which are the rich elite, that are keeping everyone else poor, and they're trying to benefit themselves at the expense of others. And so if you ask the question, do you think that QAnon contains some truths about US politics? You definitely see, if you're more zero-sum, that you believe that's the case. Okay, so this, thinking about how zero-sum people view the world, seems to explain some of the puzzles and some of the things that have been going on in the United States. Okay, so I don't want to push that too far because it's very unclear what's cause and effect. But we kind of think that this is an important, unstudied within economics aspect of individual decision making, right? And kind of your own moral framework, it really kind of influences that, and influences a lot of decision. So then the question is, well, where does this come from? So if you think of the United States, there are three things which are extremely important in US history and kind of characterize US history. One is that the US was a frontier country. And so there's really high levels of economic mobility in the 19th century and earlier, essentially. So basically when the West was being expanded, you could become economically successful if you just went far enough west. The other one was immigration. The United States is a land of immigrants. And then the other thing, which is less pleasant than both of those, is the US was built on slavery, right? You had a large number of enslaved people from Africa, which were brought to the US and forced to work on plantations and in other roles. Okay, and so So we look at the extent to which each of these is related to whether people think in zero-sum terms today, which we think is important. And so if there's economic growth, then everyone can be better off, right? That's not a zero-sum world. The zero-sum world is when there's stagnation. If one person's better off, it had to have come from someone else, right? But with enough sustained growth, we can all be better off. And so we can look at this. What we did was we measured perceived economic mobility kind of indirectly. We asked an individual right now, compared to other families in the US, what's your level of household income? And it's based on a 5-point scale, far below average, a little below average, or a little above or far above, right? And then we asked, well, when you were growing up, so that's when your parents were adults, what was your household's level of income? So in other words, what was your parents' level of income when you were growing up? And then the same thing about when your father was growing up. So that tells you the grandparents. And then when your grandfather was growing up, that tells you the great-grandparents, okay? And then we can measure upward mobility by looking at the difference between these indices, right? So basically, to what extent are the different generations better than others? And so we get this striking picture. This is how zero-sum the respondent is today. So the person taking the survey. And then this is on the x-axis, and these are just averages across the 15,000 individuals, the amount of mobility. So a positive number means there was upward mobility during the respondent's lifetime. So the measure today versus when they were growing up. So in other words, the respondent versus the father, during the father's lifetime, during the grandfather's lifetime, right? So you can see that basically the more upward mobility you experience, or your father or your grandfather experiences, the less zero-sum your thinking is today, right? You think that, oh, people can make it without taking from others, right? And so, and to some extent, that's rational because of your experiences in life, okay? Immigration. So why is immigration interesting to look at? Immigration is one of the primary sources of that upward mobility, right? And so immigrants they come from poor conditions, and then they usually do well economically in the US, if not themselves, then their children, right? So that's very common, that's been documented. And in fact, immigrants made those around them much better off as well, okay? And so that's some work I've documented. And if we look at this is same idea. Take a respondent, ask, were any of their ancestors immigrants? If they say no, this is the measure of zero-sum, quite high. If it was their grandparents that were immigrants, that's the measure of zero-sum. If their parents were immigrants, and if they themselves were immigrants, right? So the more recently you experienced immigration, the less zero-sum you are. And I think that's because you're experiencing economic upward mobility, and it doesn't appear, and probably in reality doesn't come at the expense of anyone else. And you see the same pattern if you live near immigrants as well. So this is the amount of immigration during the age of mass migration in the United States in a county. And we know what county an individual lives in, what county their parents lived in, what county their grandparents lived in. And if these ancestors lived in counties with more immigration, which then had more economic growth, you have less zero-sum thinking as well, okay? So less positively, we see the US has a lot of history of coercion. We see the opposite, where you have coercion, where you have slavery, then you have more zero-sum thinking, okay? And this is, we see African Americans, Black individuals in the United States think more zero-sum. If we ask people, were any of your ancestors enslaved? We see the same thing. And the interesting thing here is we didn't really think about it when we were doing this, but there's a lot of non-Black individuals who had ancestors that were enslaved. So for example, indigenous populations, right, had ancestors that were enslaved. We had indentured servants for people who descended from the Irish. We had examples out. We had individuals whose ancestors were in the Holocaust, and then internment during World War II as well. And so if you look at individuals, these are actually, in this case, just individuals who aren't Black, and ask, were any of your ancestors enslaved? If they were, through these cases, which I just mentioned, you view the world much more zero-sum today, okay? And then it similarly, if your ancestors lived in a slave county, same thing, more zero sum. Okay, so I think all of these things tend to line up in a way that we would expect. Okay, so we just return back to the question, well, what divides us? In this case, the divisions are within the United States. You can say, well, the answer is that take two individuals, they have very different views. One's a Democrat, one's a Republican. They argue with one another. Well, their ancestors had different experiences, right? There's nothing kind of normative in the sense that one's right, one's wrong. In some sense, they're both right and they both follow this logic. And so that's one clear explanation, right? And even within countries, you have different ancestral experiences. But there's a second source of divergence, actually, and this occurs anytime that the world changes. Okay, so even two individuals who experience the same history can have a divergence. Okay, and so this, I'll show you this example here comes from basically a mathematical model, and it's basically a case where the world changes at time zero, and the world changes in the model in such a way that the optimal heuristic or the right heuristic also changes. And remember, the thing about these heuristics, these customs, these traditions, they change slowly, right? That's why they work. So the fact that there is some persistence, some stickiness in alkali processing a maize is why it works. If people had abandoned it right away when they thought it was wrong, then it's not going to work. So what you have here is slow adoption of a new heuristic or a new value and belief in response to a changing world, right? So this population, which had the same history, half the population after a few generations is going to think the old way of doing things is right. Half the population is going to think the new way of doing things is right. Okay, so this is a different source of dynamics of divergence, and it's kind of random to some extent, right? And then in this case, remember the other case I said, well, there's no right and there's no wrong. In this case, you can actually assign one heuristic as right and wrong in some sense, that the optimal heuristic is to change, is this one up here. So this is the proportion of people with the new action, but you're only going to slowly change, right? So these individuals here are in some sense undertaking the wrong action, right? And so the model predicts, if you think this is what's going on in the world changed, there are outmoded heuristics, and then there are modern heuristics, that the younger generation is going to be better matched for the current environment, right? So here, over generations, the younger generation adopts the new the new heuristic, right? And so we can look at that in our data and think about, well, what's the less mismatched or the way of thinking that's best suited for the current environment, right? And if we look at the data and use this heuristic and say, well, what are the young people doing, and use that as a way to assess this, then what you find is the young people are more zero sum. They view the world as being much more zero sum than the old people in our data. Okay, so these are the respondents' age, average level of zero sum, and you see this kind of this discontinuity around the age, around my age, basically, of in between 40 and 50. Okay. So that's one explanation is, well, the world is much more zero sum today, and the young people think that, right? Is that true? We can look at the data and say, well, what was the US like in the past? And I kind of alluded to this already, that the US, there was really high levels of mobility, right? Probably because of the expropriation of land from indigenous populations, because of globalization, because of use of slave labor. And then over time, this mobility has declined, okay? And this has been well documented by a number of individuals. And this is some data from Emmanuel Sayed's. It just says, what's the average economic growth during these 10-year periods for the bottom 50%, right? And that's particularly important that we have that statistic, because the top 0.1% is really going to bias this. And so you see, and these are the years of the respondents, if they were born in those time periods, that individuals here, and let me go to the next slide, if you're 50 years and above, then the amount of economic growth during your lifetime, or when you were born, the first 10, 20 years of your life, is really phenomenal. And it's these younger individuals that were born more recently, the amount of growth is pretty dismal. And it turns out 50 to 60 years, right here, right around 50, that pretty much coincides with this difference. Okay, so this is the other way to say it. This is just aggregating things a bit more. For people that are 50 to 80, during in their experience, they saw this phenomenal economic growth. People who were born in the 70s and later is much more stagnation, and that's the difference you see here. Okay, so the explanation would be young people today face a world that's much less zero-sum. So they have more zero-sum views, and therefore they tend to be more progressive or more democratic. And then individuals which are older, they grew up in a period of affluence, and then their views are a bit late. They're at least a few decades delayed, right? And so they think there's no role for government. We don't need universal health care. We don't need social safety nets. If people are poor, they're not working hard enough. And so they have a non-zero-sum view of the world. Okay. So I'm a bit over time, but I'll just take 3 more minutes, and then just the question is, how general is this? And so there is some data in the World Values Survey that has one zero-sum question, and we have the political scale, and you see the exact same pattern. This is a bin scatter partial correlation plot where you have survey wave fixed effects. And so if you're more zero-sum, you're more likely to be left-leaning. Left-leaning is a lower number, right-leaning is a higher number. So more likely to be liberal, less likely to be conservative. So in other words, believe there's a role of government in society. And then the other part of this was, well, if you experience economic stagnation, then you're going to have more zero-sum beliefs. This was this mismatch idea. And so here, basically, you see the more economic growth you had in your country in the first 20 years of your life, the less zero-sum you are, right? So poor economic conditions means you're more zero-sum. So that seems to actually be pretty general. And then just the last thing I want to say is about mismatch in general. So I did kind of zoom through it pretty quickly, but I think this notion of mismatch is important because the world is inherently dynamic, even though our models in econ are quite static. We have kind of constrained maximization, not much change, but in reality, the world is changing all the time, right? And remember, we rely on these heuristics, and these heuristics evolve, but they might be outdated, right? And so it's important to think about, well, when is the world changing, or when has the world changed? Okay. And I would think that, well, today, or today or these years, are we facing a critical juncture? Is the world changing, right? So we have things like climate crisis is super important, global health crises, so the pandemic, things like that. Are these problems different from the problems in the past? So in the past, I would say it's basically Western European countries trying to outconquer different parts of the world, trying to outcompete, a lot of violence, a lot of conflict. That was the competition of the past, or those were the problems of the past, empire building, nation building. Today, the problems that we face might be different, and they might be more collective, right? So in the past, what are the heuristics that won? Well, it's Western European cultures. These are more independent, individualistic, psychologically analytic, and then they're less conforming, less in-group loyal. And so this is in the psychology literature called individualistic cultures versus collectivist cultures. So this is Western European cultures rather than pretty much indigenous cultures anywhere else in the world, right? And so these won out in the past in terms of empire building, but how well matched are they for the challenges of the future? So climate crisis, global health crises, right? So these are the heuristics which have emerged, but now the world's changed and they might not be the right heuristics. So there is some evidence for this. So climate crises, amongst individualistic cultures or individualistic individuals, there's less support for measures to combat climate change. If we think that's an important aspect of what we need to do in the future, then individualistic people don't seem to be supporting that. Same with global health crises, is more individualistic societies that had a harder time with COVID, basically. And there's lots of evidence showing that, right? So this individualistic Western European values, are they best suited for the crises that we're facing in the future, right? And so here's just one example about, if we think about property rights and how natural resources are managed. And if you talk to a lot of or are in societies within Africa, land is viewed very differently. Natural resources are viewed very differently. And it's not a source of wealth. It's not an object for sale. There's not really markets in land in a lot of parts of Africa. But here, this quote is from Lord Haley: "Land to the African is the very source and basis of life. The existence of his family or tribe is something more personal and fundamental to him. So it has inherent value." And part of the reason is, and this is a second quote, is because the land's not owned by the living, but the land belongs to the lineage, right? And it belongs to a vast family, many of which are dead. There's a few that are living now, and then a countless number that are unborn, right? So it's a very different view of natural resource management, where I'm just a custodian of the resource of the earth, and there's future generations, there's past generations. They own it as much as we do. And so I need to take their preferences into account, right? I don't want to damage it and ruin it for everyone else and ruin the legacy of my ancestors, right? And that's very different than an individualistic view, where this is an asset, it can be bought and sold. And Western institutions are very good at ensuring cooperation amongst individuals who are alive, right, through laws and other institutions. But amongst individuals which are yet to be born, we don't have those mechanisms. And so I think it's something interesting to think about what cultural traits have been successful in the past, but then what will be successful in the future, right? And there's a whole diversity of traits, of ways of thinking, of values and beliefs that exist around the world. And I would say they're dominated in lots of our institutional organizations by a Western European way of thinking, right? And is that going to be mismatched for the challenges of the future? Okay, so I'll just conclude. And so hopefully the points I wanted to make, I know we only had 45 minutes, but that human decision-making is really aided by the use of heuristics. This is different, slightly different than the rational actor framework that we think of. It just means in reality, we're using shortcuts. We're not perfectly optimizing. And these shortcuts are shaped by the environment, right? So what shortcuts are beneficial, what heuristics, values, beliefs are beneficial are going to be shaped by the environment, and they're transmitted across generations. So my ancestors' environment is going to affect the way I think today, actually, right? And so something as far away as was the plow used 6,000 years ago is going to have some effect on how I view gender today. It's not going to be the whole thing. It's going to be a tiny fraction, but it is important. So disagreements can arise because people have faced different historical environments and their ancestors have. But also when the world changes, people are going to change and groups are going to change at different speeds, right? And so because the world's dynamic, it's always changing, these two things are really mixed up. And then this is all just to say, I think there is a logic. So when people disagree, I think it's helpful to say, well, there is a logical scientific reason for our disagreement. It's not purely moral, that one person's evil, the other one's good, or that one's right and one's wrong necessarily, that there is a logic and it comes down to something as fundamental as this. So, okay, I'll stop there and then happy to take any questions.
Well, thank you, Nathan. That was incredible. And I don't think I've ever thought about the world as a zero-sum game, but it definitely gives me lots of food for thought and how that relates to, for example, New Zealand and where we are. So let's open the floor for questions. So yeah, Tim will pass on the microphone.
I'd like to apologize for this question, but I couldn't help but notice that when you had the graph with the ancestry, with the grandparents and the father, you only talked about the father. Why didn't you say grandparents or parents? Okay.
Yeah. So that's a great. So we collected information on all the parents. And then, so that one where it was the father specifically, we were talking about economic conditions. And just because, there's a male bias in terms of employment and that in the US historically, then in that case, we just calculated it with the father. And so in general, though, you can do it where you average across all 4 grandparents. Yeah. And that's just the one that I just chose to report for that reason. But yeah.
Excuse me, my question is that do you think the conflict of ideology is less fundamental than the reason and economical reason? For example, some people maybe believe the atheism, other people are religious. This conflict is less fundamental than the economic reason. My second question is that there was a survey in America talking about the effect of education. They found that the people entering the university, they are less inclined, they're less likely to believe in relativism, except the people majored in education. That means the education seems to make people less divisive. That's my question.
Education. Okay. On the first one, I wasn't sure if I fully understood, but you're wondering whether the differences in values and beliefs are more or less fundamental than differences in economic reasoning. Is that right? Yeah. Well, I think they're related. So I think the example that we're giving about policies, like should we have universal health care? What should the tax rate be on the wealthy? That's just purely economic reasoning. And you might think, like, in some sense, it's a puzzle about why there's so much disagreement in certain countries about that, and why they can't just sit down and logically reason it out. And we think that, well, there's underlying differences in the values and beliefs, which in that particular example came down to a zero-sum view. But one way to think of it is, some people have just this gut reaction that when they see Jeff Bezos, right, so the founder of Amazon, that he's a billionaire and it's a failure that our society has created a billionaire, right? You do see signs like that, and people who have that view that every billionaire is a failure. There's another view that no, he's a beacon of hope, he's success, he's fantastic. And those are just gut feelings. And I think those guide how you think about policy without too much thought, right? And I think if there's one thing I know about politics in the US, that a lot of it is about emotion and less of it about economic reasoning about policy, right? And so sometimes so in that sense, it's more fundamental, because I think often gut reactions, emotions crowd out purely economic reasoning when it comes to things like policy. And then education, less divisive, is kind of interesting. I think in our not sure how many graduate students there are in the room, but in our data, what we find is if you're more educated, you're less zero-sum in your thinking, and until you get to the level of PhD, then you become more zero-sum. And I think you realize jobs are extremely scarce for PhD students, particularly in the sciences, and it's super competitive, hyper competitive. And then you become more, and you seem to become more zero-sum, right? And so the affluence with with a college education, undergraduate education, that means less scarcity, you become less zero-sum, but there's this non-monotonicity. And so that's what we see in ours. So, yeah.
Thank you. I had a question. First of all, I'd like to thank you very much for a very stimulating address. My question is about leadership styles, and different cultures have different leadership styles. And we think that democracy is pure, but it's not. You have a comment about heuristic effects and the effect of leadership styles.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I think that's a great example. So I have a student who's studying this right now. So around the world, one cultural difference is what you can call as has been described as gerontocracy, the extent to which there's deference based on age, right? And it's like in some cultures it's called filial piety. And so you think of also its the extent to which there's hierarchy based on age. So if you take that to its logical conclusion and think about, well, if we start with family and there's this age deference structure that varies across societies, and then we're going to decide, well, how do we elect leaders which are outside the family and at the national level, right? And so there's a sociologist named Emmanuel Todd that says, well, what do? Well, we take the cues from how leaders are structured in our family, right? And then and use that. So basically what this research is finding is where there's more gerontocracy, then you're more likely to have autocracy. So if you think of a gerontocratic system, basically a person, whether they're a leader or not, is just given by age, right? It's not based on competition or how well you do. And so that's more compatible with an autocratic form of governance, right? And where the leader is like the father, which you don't choose your father, that's just given. You don't choose an autocrat, they're just given. Whereas you have other systems which are less vertically structured, and those tend to be more compatible with democracies, right? So even for things like formal institutions, which I think are super important, that there is a cultural basis and a cultural foundation for them. And the other thing that Emmanuel Todd did talk about as well is things like primogeniture. Do you treat all sons the same, right? Or sons and daughters in some cultures, or does the oldest son get all the land, for example? And he where there was more equality across the children in those societies, they tended to be communist, right? In Europe, where he was looking at. So it's arguable that there is a cultural basis to the political institutions that emerge, right? So.
Great, thank you. There might be time for one more question, if there's a burning question in the room.
The last 40 years has seen the distribution of income becoming more skewed. There's a higher concentration of wealth at the top. And we can trace that back to some extent to the rise of Thatcherism in Europe, UK, Reaganism in the US, the fall of communism. And do you think that has anything to do with the greater adoption of this zero-sum view? Those developments.
Yeah. No, I think that's intimately tied into this. So I think it's an open question. And this is really the zero-sum view. That top 1%, what does that mean for the bottom 50%, right? So, and I think that's a big debate. And then we really don't know, there's no economist that knows how those two things are connected. One view is trickle-down economics. We should all be happy the top 1% is getting richer because it's going to trickle down to the rest of us. The other, and that's a non-zero-sum view. The other is a zero-sum view, which there's a link between the stagnation of the bottom 50% and then the phenomenal growth of the top 1%, top 0.1%. And we don't really know which is true, right? And we're kind of relying on, even if it is subconsciously, our gut reaction and heuristics about how we view that, right? And so some literally view increasing inequality, think that doesn't matter. Who cares if the top's getting richer? That inequality doesn't matter. We should just look at the specific groups and how they're doing in some sense. And inequality is not bad per se if it's associated with growth. And so, and I think that's kind of at the core of this is, do you view the wealth of the rich as coming at the expense of the poor, right? And I think that's kind of what we're trying to think through, and by no means do we have the answer, but we think that's an important part of it, and that's in the back of people's minds. So once you start thinking about thinking of the world as zero sum or not. Now, I think when you read newspaper headlines, you'll get a sense of, oh, this is thinking of the world in terms of zero sum. This one's not. And when you talk to people, the implications depend on whether they're viewing the world as zero sum. Yeah. So, and then just last thing is within economics, we under teach and under appreciate externalities. We don't learn that until third year, but externalities are everywhere. People don't exist in a silo. My actions affect someone else, right? And so I think, yeah, I think this is, economists probably underappreciate the importance of zero sumness or not, if you want to think of that, or positive and negative externalities between individuals. Yeah.
I said no more questions, but I couldn't deny one of my three bosses who wants to ask a question. So that's Mary.
Thank you so much, Nathan, for being brave enough to study a really difficult topic and to share your views on it. Thank you so much. What an informative talk. I wanted just one question, and thank you, Laura, for allowing me that question. Whether you've looked at zero-sum thinking and the role of technology in the future, and whether that at all is linked to people's worldview of, for example, whether they will lose their jobs, or if, you know, the thinking that new jobs will be created.
Yeah, that's something we need to do. So the studying it in the future is a bit tough, but we can look at the past and we've had lots of innovation and see, you know, how does that affect people's zero-sum thinking? Because, you know, if you think of knowledge, the standard description of knowledge is non-rival. We can all benefit by learning how to do something better, right? If it's a better blueprint. And so that's a non-zero-sum world. So looking to the future, that might be, you know, our salvation is technological change, innovation, and people do think of that in terms of climate change and other issues. In the past, innovation might be associated with less zero-sum thinking, right? And so that's something we haven't studied yet. We can look at patent data or other episodes of innovation. And the Industrial Revolution may have been the shift in the way people viewed the world as well. And so that's something we haven't looked at yet. But yeah. And so, yeah, so I think that's super fascinating. And then knowledge creation and innovation is gotta be important for sure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Nathan, for that incredibly thought-provoking talk. And isn't that Canadian accent just beautiful to listen to as well? I hear it every day at home.
Yeah.
So would you all join me for thanking Nathan for delivering this?
Great, and thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
Thank you, Nathan, so much. And so I wish you could join us for drinks. We have Pinot Noir, you know, New Zealand Pinot Noir.
Yeah.
Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay. So I'm very sorry that you're missing out, but next time. So as you know, the invitation is always there when you want to come visit us.
Great. Well, I hope to be there soon. I hope everyone enjoys themselves, even though I can't partake. And so, yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for all the questions and for the discussion. So thank you.
Thanks so
Bye.
much. Bye.